When people talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict, one of the most common assumptions is that it's been raging for centuries, a timeless feud born out of religious hatred between Jews and Muslims. While religion plays a role, the roots of this conflict are surprisingly modern. What we're really looking at is a political and territorial struggle, one that took shape just over a century ago during a time of massive upheaval in the Middle East. For hundreds of years, the region we now call Israel and Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire. It lay along the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, a land that was religiously and culturally diverse. Most of the population were Muslim Arabs, alongside Christian communities and a small but steady Jewish minority, many of whom had lived there for generations. Life wasn't perfect, but for the most part, these communities coexisted under Ottoman rule. Local identities were tied more to religion, family, or town than to national identity as we think of it today. There was no Palestinian nation-state, but there was a population with deep roots in the land. Arab farmers, merchants, and townspeople who considered the region their home. But by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the world was changing fast. Across Europe and the Middle East, nationalism was reshaping identities. In the Middle East, Arabs were increasingly developing a sense of themselves as a people, and within that, a distinct Palestinian identity began to form. This wasn't ancient. It was a response to modern political forces. At the same time, far away in Europe, a very different national movement was taking shape: Zionism. This was a political and cultural movement that emerged in response to centuries of anti-Semitism. Jews in Europe had endured pogroms, discrimination, and exclusion. Many began to argue that Judaism was not just a religion, but a nation, and like other nations, it deserved its own homeland. Zionists looked to the historic land of Israel, the ancestral homeland mentioned in Jewish tradition, as the place to build a safe national refuge. This wasn't just symbolic. They believed the only way to escape European persecution was to establish a Jewish state. In the first decades of the 20th century, waves of Jewish immigrants began arriving from Europe, many escaping violence and discrimination. They purchased land, often from absentee landlords, and set up agricultural communes in communities. Initially, these new arrivals were relatively small in number, and they coexisted with local Arabs. But over time, as immigration increased, so did tension. Local Arabs worried that this growing movement wasn't just about coexistence, it was about building a separate national home, possibly at the expense of the indigenous population. This was the beginning of a profound clash of national aspirations. On one side, Zionists who saw the land as their historic homeland and wanted to establish a Jewish state. On the other, Palestinian Arabs who saw themselves as the rightful inhabitants of the land and feared displacement. Then came World War I, a global conflict that shattered empires. By the war's end, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and Britain and France carved up much of the Middle East between them. In 1920, the League of Nations awarded Britain control over a territory it called the British Mandate for Palestine. Britain now governed the region that today includes Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. At first, the British allowed and even facilitated Jewish immigration, partly because of the Balfour Declaration of 1917a, statement in which Britain expressed support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, while also saying that nothing should prejudice the rights of existing non-Jewish communities. But balancing these promises proved impossible. As more Jewish immigrants arrived in the 1920s and 1930s, tensions between Jewish and Arab communities grew. Sporadic violence and riots broke out. Each side increasingly saw the other as a threat to its national future. By the 1930s, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Palestinian Arabs, fearing loss of land and power, rose up against both Zionist immigration and British rule, culminating in a large Arab revolt between 1936 and 1939. In response, Britain restricted Jewish immigration, hoping to calm the tensions. But this decision came at a terrible moment. Across Europe, anti-Semitism was intensifying. And then came the Holocaust. The Nazi genocide during World War II killed 6 million Jews, leaving the Jewish world devastated. Survivors emerged from concentration camps with nowhere to go. In this desperate moment, British-controlled Palestine became a beacon of hope for many. Waves of Holocaust survivors and other Jewish refugees began trying to enter the territory, legally and illegally, overwhelming the British authorities. The horrors of the Holocaust also transformed global opinion. Many Western nations now felt a moral imperative to support the creation of a Jewish homeland. By the mid-1940s, Britain was exhausted. It had faced years of violent resistance from both Palestinian Arabs and increasingly militant Jewish groups who wanted to end British control and establish a state. Britain decided to hand the issue over to the newly formed United Nations. In 1947, the UN proposed a partition plan. The territory would be divided into 2 separate states, one Jewish and one Arab. Jerusalem would be placed under international administration, recognizing its religious importance to Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike. The Jewish leadership accepted the plan, even though it didn't give them everything they wanted. The Arab leadership rejected it, viewing it as unjust and colonial, yet another European power imposing a decision on their land. Many Arab states had only recently gained independence from European empires, and they saw the partition as part of the same colonial story, outsiders carving up the Arab world without their consent. In May 1948, the Jewish leadership declared the independence of the State of Israel. Within hours, neighboring Arab countries declared war. Their goal was to prevent the establishment of Israel and to create a unified Arab Palestine over the entire territory. What followed was a brutal war that reshaped the map and set the stage for everything that would come after. Israel not only survived the war, it expanded its territory far beyond what the UN plan had allotted. By the war's end, Israel controlled about 78% of the former British mandate. It had taken West Jerusalem and much of the land designated for the Arab state. More than 700,000 Palestinians were displaced or expelled, becoming refugees, a population whose descendants today number in the millions. Meanwhile, Egypt took control of Gaza and Jordan annexed the West Bank. There was no Palestinian state. The end of the 1948 war didn't bring peace. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new and volatile chapter, one defined by wars between Israel and its Arab neighbors, massive population movements, and the gradual transformation of the conflict from a regional struggle into a direct confrontation between Israelis and Palestinians. By 1949, Israel had not only survived its war of independence, but emerged larger than the UN had intended. The newly drawn armistice lines, often called the Green Line, left Israel in control of most of the territory, while Gaza was administered by Egypt, and Jordan annexed the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. For the Palestinian Arabs, the consequences were catastrophic. Around 750,000 Palestinians became refugees, forced to flee their towns and villages during the war. Many expected to return once the fighting ended. But Israel barred their return, arguing that allowing them back would undermine the new Jewish state. This mass displacement became known as the Nakba, or catastrophe in Arabic, and it remains one of the core traumas of Palestinian national identity. Refugees crowded into camps in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, often living in temporary shelters that gradually became permanent communities. Over generations, their descendants would grow to millions, forming a diaspora with no state. Inside Israel, the new state faced huge challenges. It absorbed hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants, not only from Europe, but also from Arab-majority countries. In the 1950s and 1960s, rising regional tensions and persecution in places like Iraq, Egypt, and Yemen led to a massive wave of Jewish migration to Israel. Many of these Jews were expelled or fled, leaving centuries-old communities behind. Meanwhile, the surrounding Arab states faced their own transformations. Many were newly independent, grappling with post-colonial realities. Some saw the defeat of 1948 as a humiliation that needed to be avenged. Others viewed the Palestinian cause as a rallying point for Arab nationalism. This was especially true in Egypt under Gamal Abdel Nasser, who rose to power in the 1950 and championed the idea of a united Arab front against Israel and Western influence. In June 1967, rising tensions boiled over again. Border skirmishes, rhetoric, and military mobilizations between Israel and its neighbors, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan reached a breaking point. Israel, feeling encircled and threatened, launched a preemptive strike against Egypt and Syria. The war lasted just 6 days, but its consequences were enormous. Israel decisively defeated the Arab armies and seized vast territories. Through Egypt, it took the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip. From Jordan, it captured the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. From Syria, it occupied the Golan Heights. For the first time, Israel was now in control of all of Jerusalem, including the Old City and its sacred sites like the Western Wall and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This was a moment of immense symbolic power for Israelis, who saw it as a historic reunification of their capital. But for Palestinians, it meant that the remainder of their land was now under Israeli military occupation. The end of the 1967 war marked the beginning of a long military occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem territories where millions of Palestinians lived. Overnight, Palestinians went from being under Egyptian or Jordanian rule to living under Israeli military control. Israel now faced a profound dilemma. It had captured territories with a large Palestinian population. If it annexed the land and granted citizenship, the Jewish state would have a large Arab population, challenging its identity as a Jewish majority state. If it kept the land without granting rights, it would roam over millions of people without giving them political representation. For Palestinians, the occupation was disorienting and humiliating. Checkpoints, military rule, and the sense of living under a foreign power became daily realities. Many hoped this situation would be temporary, that Israel would withdraw, or a peace deal would return their land. But as time passed, the occupation became increasingly entrenched. In the 1970s, the wider Arab-Israeli conflict saw dramatic shifts. In 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel during Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. Although Israel ultimately pushed back the assault, the war shocked Israeli society and proved that the Arab states could still pose a serious threat. But what followed was even more surprising: peace. In 1978, Egypt's President Anwar Sadat and Israel's Prime Minister Menachem Begin signed the Camp David Accords, brokered by the United States. As part of the deal, Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in exchange for formal recognition and peace. It was the first time an Arab state had made peace with Israel. But this peace came at a cost. Sadat faced fierce backlash in the Arab world, and in 1981, he was assassinated by extremists, partly motivated by his peace with Israel. Still, the Camp David Accords marks the beginning of the end of the Arab-Israeli interstate wars. Over the next decades, many Arab states gradually moved toward accommodation, even if they didn't sign peace treaties. But for Palestinians, this development was bittersweet. The wider Arab world was shifting its focus away from the Palestinian cause, leaving them to face Israel more directly. During this period, the Palestinian Liberation Organization (PLO) emerged as the primary political and military representative of the Palestinian people. Formed in the 1960s, the PLO initially aimed to liberate all of historic Palestine, rejecting the existence of Israel. Led by Yasser Arafat, the PLO conducted guerrilla attacks, hijackings, and other operations, often launched from neighboring countries like Jordan and Lebanon. Israel considered the PLO a terrorist organization, and tensions between the group and surrounding Arab governments sometimes boiled over. In 1970, for example, the PLO's growing power in Jordan led to open conflict with King Hussein's regime, resulting in what became known as Black September, in which thousands were killed and the barn. PLO was expelled. The organization then moved its base of operations to Lebanon. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon with the stated aim of pushing the PLO away from its northern border. Israeli forces advanced all the way to Beirut, besieging the city for weeks. Under international pressure, the PLO eventually evacuated to Tunisia. But the war left deep scars. It also resulted in the Sabra and Shatila massacre, in which Christian militias allied with Israel killed hundreds, possibly thousands of Palestinian refugees. Although Israeli troops didn't carry out the killings, they controlled the area, and an Israeli commission later found the government indirectly responsible for failing to prevent the massacre. This event severely damaged Israel's international reputation and fueled Palestinian anger. While these military and political battles were unfolding, something quieter but equally significant was happening on the ground: Israeli settlement building. After 1967, Israel began allowing and often encouraging Jewish citizens to settle in the occupied territories. Some settlers moved for religious reasons, believing they were reclaiming biblical lands. Others moved because the government offered financial incentives, cheap housing, and subsidies. Over time, settlements spread throughout the West Bank and Gaza, ranging from small outposts to large towns with thousands of residents. Wherever settlers went, the Israeli military followed to protect them, establishing checkpoints and security zones that fractured Palestinian communities. For Palestinians, the settlements were more than symbolic. They ate up land, divided villages, and made daily life harder. Over the long term, they complicated any future plan to establish a viable Palestinian state, because the land that might have formed that state was increasingly occupied and fragmented. By the late 1980s, after decades of occupation and growing settlement expansion, Palestinian frustration boiled over. In December 1987, a traffic accident involving an Israeli truck and Palestinian workers in Gaza triggered widespread protests. But this was just the spark. Years of anger, hopelessness, and repression erupted into the First Intifada, or uprising. Unlike the PLO's external military campaigns, the Intifada was largely grassroots. It involved mass demonstrations, boycotts, strikes, and civil disobedience, alongside clashes with Israeli forces. As the months passed, the protests became increasingly violent, and Israel responded with heavy force. Over the course of the uprising, around 200 Israelis and more than 1,000 Palestinians were killed. Images of Israeli soldiers confronting stone-throwing Palestinian youths were broadcast around the world, shifting international perceptions of the conflict. The Palestinians were no longer just seen as refugees, they were now viewed as a people under occupation demanding rights. During this period, a new Palestinian force emerged: Hamas. Founded in 1987 in Gaza, Hamas was an Islamist movement that rejected the PLO's secular nationalism and advocated for the destruction of Israel. It combined social services, religious outreach, and militant activity, quickly gaining popularity among segments of the Palestinian population who saw the PLO as corrupt and ineffective. The rise of Hamas added a new ideological dimension to the conflict. From this point on, Palestinian politics would be split between the secular nationalists of the PLO and the religious militants of Hamas, a division that continues to shape events today. By the 1990s, after decades of wars, uprisings, and political shifts, both Israelis and Palestinians seemed ready to explore a path toward peace. The Cold War was ending, regional alliances were shifting, and global attention was on diplomacy rather than war. Many hoped this would finally lead to a resolution of the century-old conflict. But instead, the decades that followed brought failed negotiations, new divisions, cycles of violence, and deepening stalemate. This is the story of how the modern reality, one of occupation, settlement expansion, and political deadlock, took shape. In 1993, representatives of Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, secretly met in Norway to negotiate what became known as the Oslo Accords. For the first time, both sides officially recognized each other. Israel recognized the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. The PLO recognized Israel's right to exist and renounced violence. The agreement was not a final peace treaty, but a framework for gradual change. It proposed a 5-year transitional period, during which Israel would withdraw from parts of the West Bank and Gaza, and Palestinians would govern themselves in certain areas. This led to the creation of the Palestinian Authority (PA), a semi-autonomous governing body meant to handle local administration, security, and services in designated zones. The hope was that, step by step, this process would build trust and institutions, eventually leading to a two-state solution, an independent state of Palestine alongside Israel. For a moment, it seemed possible. The image of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat, and UAE as President Bill Clinton shaking hands on the White House lawn became a symbol of a new era. But not everyone supported Oslo. Hardliners on both sides viewed the accords as a betrayal. Among Palestinians, groups like Hamas rejected the very idea of recognizing Israel. Hamas and other militant groups launched suicide bombings and attacks in Israeli cities, aiming to undermine public support for the peace process. Among Israelis, the right-wing opposition denounced Oslo as dangerous and naive. Mass rallies were held against the agreement, and Rabin was portrayed by some protesters as a traitor. In 1995, just 2 years after Oslo was signed, Rabin was assassinated by a far-right Israeli extremist at a peace rally in Tel Aviv. His death was a devastating blow to the peace movement. Without Rabin's leadership and political capital, the process began to stall. Successive Israeli governments were less committed to the Oslo vision, and Palestinian trust began to erode as settlement construction continued even during negotiations. At the end of the decade, a major effort was made to finalize the peace process. In July 2000, US President Bill Clinton brought Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat to Camp David for intense negotiations. The goal was to hammer out final status issues: borders, Jerusalem, refugees, settlements, security arrangements. The talks ultimately collapsed without an agreement. Each side blamed the other. Barak argued that he made unprecedented concessions, and Arafat walked away Palestinians, countered that the offers didn't meet their basic demands, particularly regarding East Jerusalem and the right of return for Bambra. Refugees. For ordinary Palestinians, years had passed since Oslo began, but life under occupation hadn't meaningfully improved. Checkpoints, land confiscations, and settlement growth continued. Disillusionment was spreading. Shortly after the Camp David failure, tensions exploded. In September 2000, Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon made a controversial visit to the Temple Mount/Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem, a site sacred to both Jews and Muslims. The visit was seen by Palestinians as a provocation, and it triggered widespread protests. What started as demonstrations quickly escalated into the Second Intifada, a far more violent and militarized uprising than the first. Armed groups clashed with Israeli forces, suicide bombings struck Israeli cities, and the Israeli military launched large-scale incursions into Palestinian towns. Over the course of several years, around 1,000 Israelis and more than 3,000 Palestinians were killed. The violence shook both societies. For many Israelis, the Second Intifada shattered their faith in negotiations, leading to a sharp political shift to the right. Security became the overriding priority. For Palestinians, the uprising reflected deep frustration with a process that seemed to deliver neither peace nor independence. In response to the wave of attacks during the Second Intifada, Israel began building a vast separation barrier, often referred to as the Wall. Officially, Israel described it as a security measure, intended to stop suicide bombers from entering Israeli cities. But the barrier didn't simply follow the Green Line, the 1949 Armistice Line. In many places, it cut deep into the West Bank, surrounding Israeli settlements and isolating Palestinian communities. For Palestinians, this wasn't just a wall, it was a physical manifestation of occupation, cutting through farms, neighborhoods, and even separating families. Alongside the barrier, Israel expanded its network of checkpoints. Palestinians needed permits to move between areas, and travel that once took minutes could now take hours. This web of barriers, walls, and military zones reshaped the geography of the West Bank, making Palestinian mobility increasingly restricted. Meanwhile, Israeli settlements in the West Bank continued to grow, often with state support. By the 2000s, hundreds of thousands of Israelis were living in settlements and outposts, many of which were illegal under international law. Settlers came for different reasons, some out of religious conviction, believing they were fulfilling a divine mission. Others because of economic incentives, like cheap housing and government subsidies. And some for a mix of both. For Palestinians, settlement expansion was devastating. It meant less land, more checkpoints, and a fractured territory that made it increasingly difficult to imagine a contiguous, viable Palestinian state. In 2005, Israel took a dramatic step. It withdrew all settlers and military forces from the Gaza Strip. Then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, once a champion of settlements, argued that holding on to Gaza was unsustainable. Israel dismantled its 21 Gaza settlements and evacuated about 8,000 settlers. Many around the world saw this as a possible new opening for peace. But the aftermath was far more complicated. In 2006, Hamas won Palestinian legislative elections, capitalizing on widespread frustration with the Palestinian Authority, which many saw as corrupt and ineffective. A year later, Hamas seized full control of Gaza after a brief but intense conflict with the Fatah-dominated Palestinian Authority. This created a deep political split between the West Bank, governed nominally by the Palestinian Authority, and Gaza, ruled by Hamas. The division weakened the Palestinian national movement, leaving it fractured and internally divided. In response, Israel and Egypt imposed a blockade on Gaza, controlling its borders, airspace, and coastline. They argued that the blockade was necessary to contain Hamas and prevent weapons smuggling. But the blockade had devastating effects on Gaza's economy and population. Unemployment soared to around 40%. Access to basic goods, medical supplies, and building materials was severely restricted. Gaza's infrastructure deteriorated under repeated conflicts. Since Hamas took power, Gaza has seen repeated rounds of conflict between Israeli forces and Palestinian armed groups. These escalations typically follow a tragic pattern. A political flashpoint or violent incident triggers fighting. Hamas and other groups launch rockets into Israeli cities. Israel responds with airstrikes and military operations, often targeting Hamas infrastructure, but also hitting civilian areas. After days or weeks of fighting, a ceasefire is reached until the next round. While Israeli civilians live under the threat of rocket attacks, the overwhelming number of casualties are Palestinian, including many civilians. Gaza's dense population and fragile infrastructure make every escalation catastrophic. Within Israel, public attitudes toward the conflict have shifted. Many Israelis have grown cynical about peace talks, believing there's no partner on the Palestinian side willing or able to deliver a lasting agreement. Politics have shifted rightward, with governments focusing on security and managing the status quo, rather than pursuing a comprehensive resolution. Among Palestinians, especially younger generations, there's widespread disillusionment. Decades of negotiations have produced little tangible change. The Palestinian Authority is seen by many as weak, and its legitimacy has eroded. Hamas offers resistance, but no real political horizon. For many, it feels like they are stuck between occupation, division, and stagnation. The international community has tried to intervene repeatedly through peace conferences, aid, and diplomatic initiatives. The United States remains Israel's closest ally, providing military aid and diplomatic backing. European and regional actors have offered various peace proposals, but none of these efforts have broken the deadlock. Some countries have recently normalized relations with Israel, such as through the Abraham Accords, but these agreements have largely bypassed the Palestinian issue, signaling a shift in regional priorities. The modern conflict is not ancient. It's a product of the last century of nationalism, colonial collapse, wars, displacement, ideology, and failed diplomacy. What began as two peoples claiming the same land has evolved into a deeply entrenched political and territorial struggle, with millions caught in its grip. The story is not over. Whether through diplomacy, uprising, or unforeseen change, the future of Israelis and Palestinians remains intertwined. What happens next will shape not just the region, but the world's understanding of conflict, identity, and justice.